All right, so I will go ahead and get us started. I want to welcome you all to our event, Justice in Public Health, acknowledging and engaging the work of scholars of color. I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement. The School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Makoche, which loosely translates to the land where the waters reflect the skies. It is important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. Thank you all for coming to this event. My name is Lauren Jones. I serve as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. The Justice in Public Health series was started last year as part of the School of Public Health's commitment to justice and anti-racism. We've been hosting monthly events with local and national experts around topics of public health. The speakers and presentations in this series help us to be grounded in theory and practice, as well as complement the classroom learning that our students experience. We also hope that today's discussion is part of broader change happening outside of SPH. If you're interested in staying abreast of justice in public health events, let us know by filling out the event evaluation. The link will be in the chat soon. And you can check the box to receive notifications about upcoming events. You can also visit our website at any time. This event will be recorded and available to view from our website for at least 180 days. I also want to acknowledge the recent death of Amir Locke caused by Minneapolis Police Department this week, which is heavy on many of our hearts. While we celebrate the contributions and accomplishments of Black people this month, there is still so much work to be done in the areas of justice, anti-racism, and equity. I want to now introduce our Associate Dean for Research, Marizan Ramirez, who is our partner in this event.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren, and welcome everyone. As our School of Public Health, we have a very important core mission, which is research. So I just want to state very clearly, our School of Public Health aims to improve the health and well-being of populations and communities around the world through excellence in research and education, and by advancing policies and practices that sustain health equity for all. And so as research being one of our core missions, we are and want to be intentional in our pursuit of anti-racist strategies that advance research so that it is equitable. And so today, we really are excited to have Dr. Brittany Williams come and share with us her expertise. And then we can really begin to dig deep to understand the impacts of structures that marginalize our BIPOC scholars. And today we will be specifically digging into this concept of citation bias, in which many of us as scholars, we know that we are really aimed to increase our citations. We use citations in our work, but there are biases around that. And what we want to do is learn today what exactly are the initiatives, the strategies that we can employ to be much more equitable and intentional in our efforts in our scholarship. So with that, Lauren, I'm going to pass it back to you. And again, thank you for having us today and including us in this effort as one of our faculty development workshops.
Thank you, Marizan. So to introduce our speaker, Britt Williams is an assistant professor of higher education administration at St. Cloud State University, just north of us. Originally from Southwest Atlanta, Georgia, Williams obtained her PhD in College Student Affairs Administration from the University of Georgia and holds her bachelor's and master's degrees from Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City, respectively. She is a proud product of Atlanta Public Schools. Britt, take it away.
Perfect. All right, test one. Can we see my screen? I feel like we all live in the Zoom universe at this point. It's like, is my camera on? Is my mic on? Are you muted? Okay, perfect. Thank you all so much for having me. I am delighted to talk about engaging research from scholars of color. So as I spent some time thinking about what I wanted to cover, I figured there were sort of 4 key things I wanted to make sure we had some time to chat about. So I'll talk a little bit about how I entered this conversation, some facts and data, what are some things that are on my mind as an education researcher who studies these issues of citational inequity, what are some things that are happening in public health that we need to think about and how the two are connected, some trends and issues in terms of what's being done across the country, and what folks are doing to help lead us into the next iteration of what hopefully academic publishing can look like, and then some considerations for the future. So what's next? What do we do? What is our takeaway from today's event? All right. So first things first, as mentioned in my bio, I think twice it was in there, I am from Atlanta. And like most people from the city of Atlanta and from the South in general, I find any excuse to slide into a presentation that I'm from Atlanta because we love to talk about ourselves. It's just part of the package of what we do and how we come to things. And I mention this because growing up, we had all of these phrases for people who copied off or were influenced by us, but didn't necessarily acknowledge that we started a trend or started a particular look or image. Now, there are some trends that the city of Atlanta gave us that can stay buried forever. For example, tall t-shirts. If you have any recollection of that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We can leave those in the Y2K era where they have been left, right? We don't need to bring that back. But there are some other phrases that talk about how folks engage with us when they don't necessarily give us credit that I think do carry on. And so 2 of them that I used to use all the time in high school, which is funny because my tone of voice and how I speak and everything has changed a little bit since then. But these 2 things I find frequently still come out of my mouth when I'm talking to friends or engaging with my family. And the 2 are, you know, people are copying my swag or jocking my style. And so given that these are a foundational piece of my identity, I'm such an Atlanta person, I thrive on the idea that I can be in the academy as my authentic self. I feel like it was only natural that some of that obsession translated into examining how people engage in this sort of style jockeying or copycatting or piggybacking within the academy. And so I was drawn to discussing the need to center the work of folks of color, beginning with Black women and expounding from there, because I noticed as a graduate student that there were certain types of scholarship, kinds of people and approaches to our work that was always centered, even if those folks copied, mimic, or otherwise duplicated the works of scholars of color. Shout out to the person who wrote to me in the chat that they're from Decatur. It's so nice to have you here.
Could you say that again?
Oh, and Siri also wants to join our conversation. So to get us started and sort of connect how I think about these issues of citational equity, I want to acknowledge that I'm not first, nor will I be the last person to talk about the impact of this, right? So Mexican-American critical race theorist Richard Delgado wrote an article in 1984 titled "The Imperial Scholar, Reflections on a Review of Civil Rights Literature," discussing exactly this topic. Now, in this article, Delgado tells the story of, you know, being advised to play things straight by senior scholars to avoid being entrenched in civil rights and ethnic subjects. And so he talks about, you know, admitting to taking that advice pre-tenure as part of his law career and doing just that. I'm going to do the sort of whitewash, accepted research that won't really ruffle any feathers to make sure that I reach tenure and promotion, right? And so there was a way that Delgado talks about sacrificing his focus on things that mattered, but then gaining tenure and saying, you know what, this is my opportunity to flip the script and to actually do exactly what I wanted to do when I started in law and when I came to law school. And so like many professors with resources, Delgado talks about finding a research assistant and trying to play catch up. So Delgado tells a story of, you know, I gave my research assistant a list of 20 or so leading law review articles, or asked them to provide me that list of 20 or so articles, you know, what journals they're published in, making sure they're rooted in the theoretical, so on and so forth. So Delgado's research assistant, like all good graduate students, we all know what it's like when you want to impress your faculty member, comes back with this list and they're super proud of their work, right? Super proud as grad students when you can deliver to a faculty member exactly what they ask for. And so Delgado gets the list and he tells the story in the opening of the article and notices that all of the scholars on the list are white. And not only are they all white, they're all male. Now, this is 1984. But Delgado talks about knowing that this couldn't be right because there were hundreds of scholars of color in law schools teaching in faculty positions. And they knew this because there was a list that came out where they kept track of this information. So Delgado's like, okay, clearly my research assistant has done something wrong. I'll go back and do the search. No. The research assistant was amazing. And it wasn't that the research assistant did something wrong. It was that Delgado came up with the same result and realized that despite the existence of those hundreds of minoritized faculty, none of those folks could break into that list of top citations because of what exists in terms of how we engage in citations and citational practices. So I like to call this the citational vacuum, right? It's the realm where highly cited scholars cite other highly cited scholars, and then we go on to cite folks that we train, we cite the students that we work with, so on and so forth, to the point where we've maintained this imperial citational circle or vacuum where no one else is able to break in unless they've come from the highly prestigious program or places and spaces that we inhabit. Now, sociologist Victor Ray suggests that we can continue to fall into this trap because in academia, we are obsessed with veneration of the classics, right? We always want to make sure we're talking about folks who changed the field, who were trailblazers, who gave us the classic academic works. Except the academy has been so exclusionary for so long, that's often synonymous with whiteness. So this was published in 1984, right? Which means it was probably written a little bit prior. But those of you who are in the audience, I know some of you are shaking your head because here we are in 2022, and many of us who are scholars of color are told the exact same thing. You need to play things straight. Let's try to evade doing research that's on political or hot button issues, shy away from things that talk about critical race theory or systemic oppression or isms in our work so that we can be published. But the fact that we have a piece that was published in 1984 talking about this, and the same conversation happens in the academy in 2022, tells us just how deep-seated these issues are. And it also helps to bring us back to reality when we have these feel-good moments and beliefs that the academy has changed or things are dramatically different. So for me in education, that has a lot of implications, but for those of you who are in public health, this vacuum has real material consequences for the lives of a lot of people. So let's talk a little bit about that. According to the Association of American Medical Colleges, AAMC, Hispanic and Latino Americans make up 20% of the US population, but only 6% of current physicians and 5.3% of medical school graduates. African Americans make up 13% of the US population, 5% of current physicians, and less than 7% of recent medical school graduates. For Indigenous folks, pitiful. 2% of the US population, but only 0.4% of current physicians and less than 0.2% of recent medical school graduates are Indigenous or Native. The proportion of those folks actually dropped from 0.4 to 0.2 between 2006 and 2017. Now, Asian Americans are 7% of the population, and they do make up a larger portion of medical doctors. They're 17% of our current physicians and 21% of recent medical school graduates. However, anti-Asian sentiments mean that while this is the second largest demographic of doctors in our country, they don't all get to enjoy the full participation of what it means to be in the medical profession. Now, I'm focusing on doctors, and many of you are from public health. But you and I both know that the role the public health scholars play is to borrow from your own school's website, right? Is to provide the knowledge that health departments communities, and policymakers need to make the best decision about population health. So you're effectively doing the work of organizing our medical efforts, but it's medical doctors who are the face of medicine and health for so many of us in this country, whereas you all are sort of in the background or behind the scenes doing the work that helps to inform medical practice. Well, since it's Black History Month, let's make that a little bit cleaner, right? Let's put it like this. I think of doctors, nurses, people who have frontline, front-facing interactions in the medical field with patients as the Martin Luther Kings of medicine, right? They're the face, they're the people you go to, the people you think of. But in public health, you all are Bayard Rustin. You're the person in the background who's setting the tone, setting the standards, and setting the expectations around how we understand medicine in broad strokes, how we communicate that, and what it means for how we systemically solve problems of health. Now, that's not an inherently bad thing, right? My dream is to be a Bayard Rustin, not necessarily an MLK personally, but I always end up talking because I have a big mouth, so here we are. But the problem with this setup in this scenario is that the disparities of the faces of medical care make it harder for you all to do some of that broad access and large scale work. And the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine hesitancy, for example, are an example of how this collision of medical doctors, public health scholars, and dis and misinformation makes it harder for us to all do our part to help create healthy communities. So let's look at a couple of these recent headlines, right? Using COVID-19 as a specific example. Folks of color tend to be more cautious about using vaccines. Folks have waited a little bit longer to see what the impact of the vaccine might be. Some folks situate vaccine hesitancy as part of a longer history of medical mistrust. And so the fact of the matter is that medicine generally, but public health specifically, has a major trust and communication issue when it comes to communities of color. So what's the fastest way that we could potentially break through that? It's by decentering white norms, white approaches, and ensuring that folks who can communicate to and represent communities of color who feel some of that hesitancy, they can see themselves in the folks that we present as the faces of the field. So we're not facing just a crisis, for example, of racial identity representation, but one of racial belonging and the inability to see ourselves in what is represented by the field. But we can't be what we can't see. And citational inequalities are tied into this because it reproduces these very same issues within the scholarly environment for faculty, for folks who are training for industry, and how they go about thinking about what they're learning and who gets to consider what is knowledge. So taken together, when I think of citational inequities, what I'm talking about is, first, whose work is in the room, whose ideas, concepts, critiques do we center in our classrooms, in our course syllabi, and in our scholarly discussions. But it's not just about that. At its core, it's about whose knowledge do we consider valuable, but also who has the right to create knowledge. Now, as someone who is a higher education scholar, I have a vested interest in considering how these disparities in knowledge production and reproduction impact retention and success in the academy. That is where my world and your world collide. Also in K through 12, because our inability to do the most simple functions of US society, educate the next generation, for instance, depends on a more unified, clear, and identity conscious, but not identity pathologizing approach to public health. So that is where I need all of you to join in and start thinking about what shifts we can make to improve all of these realities. So it's even more important to me that all of you tackle this as faculty, because you are tasked with educating that next generation of public health scholars. But I want to talk a little bit about some faculty stats and some data as we're thinking about the power of who gets to determine knowledge and how we even create and get to a point of talking about course syllabi. So in the fall of 2018, there were 1.5 million faculty in degree granting post-secondary institutions. Within that 1.5 million, 54% were full-time and 46% were part-time. So this means that just under half of all faculty are occupied outside of the academy in some way because they're only doing part-time work in the academy. This could mean they're occupied with additional jobs. It could mean that folks are stuck in these sort of precarious academic Hades version of, people call it adjunct hell for lack of better language, right? Or otherwise too busy juggling life. Well, that presents an issue because it means that almost 50% of those faculty aren't able to get writing done, aren't able to contribute to the scholarly canon or the body of knowledge, but also a large portion of that demographic is women of color. So women of color make up a comparatively large portion or proportion, if you will, of part-time faculty on all of our college campuses, which means that is a large number of folks who could contribute to what we know, what we think of as knowledge, and what we think of as learning, but don't necessarily have access to for whatever reasons, including their inability to engage because they're busy. So let's pull that out a little bit more, right? And look at full-time faculty even by the numbers. So of all full-time faculty in degree granting post-secondary institutions, 75% are white. 75% are white, and white men account for 40 of that 75%, which means white women make up the remaining 35%. 12% of those folks are Asian, with men again representing a larger share at 7% compared to 5% of Asian women. For Black and Hispanic folks, they're both at 6% and statistically even, with 3% for both men and women as reported to the National Center for Education Statistics. And then the numbers for Indigenous and Alaska Native faculty make up less than 1% of all full-time folks who are employed in or work on our college campuses. So this raises a lot of questions if we look at it just at face value, part one, because we know that 75% of all students who are enrolling in secondary and post-secondary education are not white, particularly at public institutions of higher learning, where there's a larger share of students of color enrolling. That's not reflected in the full-time faculty members who make up the academy. And in public health specifically, we have some even more in-depth numbers. So I got this chart through an article, and it's a special issue on scholars of color in public health. 2021 release date. And so the chart is from the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health member faculty, and it breaks down faculty by rank, race, and ethnicity. You can see it from professors, sort of full-time, tenured, highest rank that we have, all the way down to folks who are lecturers, and also other, which is unclear, but could be adjuncts, could be a variation of things here. And so the author who talks about this in that special issue says, these data come from the American Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health, excluding Puerto Rico and non-US members. As of February 2021, there were 130 Association of School and Programs of Public Health members, but 219 accredited institutions by the Council on Education for Public Health. So there's missing data from about 41% of schools. However, by the numbers, this is what racial inequity looks like. The disproportion, especially of Black, Latinx, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, and American Indian faculty is glaring. Such data do not approximate our overall population. Per the census in 2019, the racial and ethnic distribution was 60% white, 13.4% Black or African American, 1.3% American Indian or Alaska Native, 5.9% Asian American, 18.5% Latinx, and 0.2% Native Hawaiian. The segregation of faculty of color in public health continues despite the increase in the numbers of students of color enrolled in public health programs. Now, there's a lot happening on this chart, right? So we can see that there are thousands of faculty in public health programs, and institutions across this country, but not as many faculty of color specifically, which means that the public health profession as a whole needs to take a pause, take a step back, and take a look inward, right? Right. So public health cannot address racial inequities and health outcomes without addressing white supremacy in the field itself. The discipline, profession, and practice of public health and public health schools, right, are all intertwined. These are all things that we have to think about in order to actually get to the process of addressing white supremacy. Now, in this quote, Dr. Along talks about the newly revised 10 essential public health services now highlight equity, but in order to live up to that goal, they must also tackle structural racism and its roots, which are white supremacy. So before we can even have a conversation about citational equity, before we think about how we adequately engage the work of scholars of color, we can't do any of these things without first taking a pause to acknowledge that white supremacy is embedded in the foundation of our institutions, in the foundation of our fields, and in the foundation of the work that we have all decided to pledge our lives to. That we need to take a moment to look at the root cause instead of trying to address these pop-up specific things that will always be unequally experienced and unequally addressed because of racism and because of white supremacy. So why citations? What do any of these disparities have to do with faculty, and what does it have to do with citations? It means that the barriers that scholars of color face are compounded, right? They're amplified when we treat citational erasure as an issue of merit or something that's meritorious in nature rather than rooted in power. It also means that scholars of color face systemic exclusion within the academy. Let's sit with that for a second. The barriers scholars of color face are compounded and amplified when we treat citational erasure as an issue of meritorious nature rather than power. So for one, scholars of color are gatekept at the very outset, right? So I go to this special issue on scholars of color. Jesus Ramirez Valles wrote in this editorial lead for the special issue called Scholars of Color, Health Education and Behavior, right, for the journal, and titles it Racism Within, special journal issue on scholars of color. And in this piece, they note that one of the straightforward, implicit, and explicit ways that bias shows up against certain names of authors, institution affiliations, geographic locations, subject matters, and populations of study is because humans are at the core of the decision-making process, and we look at all of those things when we're making our decisions. So if top journals center research from prestigious institutions, from prestigious programs, from certain kinds of schools, and scholars of color don't in droves enroll in those institutions or fall within those demographics, then they're also not studying populations that those journals don't want to focus on. It is very unlikely that their work will be published in these places. And it's also likely, right, that we won't consider their expertise if they're from outside of the country, if they're folks in international journals, if they're people beyond the scope of the West. It means that we're missing a lot of faculty of color brilliance, and we're conflating their lack of success, which is as an individual issue rather than one of systemic exclusion. So let's break that down a little bit about what I mean, right? We know that journal rank, journal impact, citation impact, all of these things are metrics that we use in the tenure and promotion processes. Because those are things that institutions are looking at, it means they are things that scholars of color must be aware of, must be prepared to unpack, and must be prepared to engage as part of their process on the way to tenure and promotion. But systemic exclusion makes it harder to do within that system, to engage within those systems, right? Because racism is embedded in the knowledge production process. So we systemically exclude scholars of color from major research journals, which causes harm well beyond that citation vacuum that I mentioned earlier, because it impacts the full span of public health work. And while I'm focusing most on citations, because that's why I'm here today, I would be remiss if I didn't paint a fuller picture of what this exclusion could look like, what it does, and the impact that it has, right? So in part because the field of public health, like all higher education in the US, is not exceptional, right? My field is no different than your field. We know that we're functioning byproducts of the society in which we're all being reared, raised. I like to think of it as sort of academic lineage, right? Who are your academic parents? So if we as scholars and educators center Western and imperial knowledge systems, right? We're looking for students, we're admitting students based off their prowess within those systems. So right then and there, students who are English as a second language, students who don't perform whiteness in a particular way are automatically excluded because those are the core and the very basis of US higher education. So then we admit students who are students of color, who are able to sort of acclimate a little better, who can take off or wear the mask, as we like to say in the Black community, people who like to engage in code switching or acquiescence to whiteness and white norms, right? So we bring those folks in, we bring them in as students of color, great. Then there's stratification within that in terms of how much a person plays the game, how much they engage in that code switching, how much they are able to embody and enact whiteness and white ways of knowing that impacts which institutions they are enrolled at. So we know that the kinds of institutions that someone is enrolled in is often directly tied to the kinds of institutions someone will go on to work at. How many faculty members from Ivy League institutions right now have degrees from Ivy League institutions? How many faculty at top 10 or top 15 public health programs in the country have degrees from top 10 or top 15 public health programs in the country? So we've reproduced all of this inequality in the student selection process, in the student sort of socialization process that happens in graduate school, and then again at the faculty hiring process as we weed people out based off institution type and the kinds of institutions that they're a part of. So from there, we get to being tenure track, right? We've made it, we're full-time, we've got that glorious tenure track role, we're all at an even playing field. Wrong. Then we've also got institution type issues along the lines of faculty of color. So whether you're at a research 1, research 2, or regional comprehensive like myself, there are things that you have to navigate as a faculty of color that your colleagues don't necessarily have to deal with. So part 1 of that is going to be added service expectations and the burden of sort of being the person that students of color go to. And I say burden in jest, right? Because we love and we care about our students of color, and we almost always do everything we can to make sure that they are able to succeed. And doing that takes away time, takes away energy, and takes away resources from the ability to write and publish. And we know that writing and publishing are sort of the bread and butter of the academy. So we've got folks trapped in this sort of service wheel and the support wheel for engaging with students of color. That's one piece. Then we've got faculty of color also trying to navigate being at different kinds of institutions and different institution types. So while they're at those different institutions, they have differential resources, they have differences in access to library materials. I have on more than one occasion, as someone who's only 75 miles north of all of you, sent an email or a quick text to someone at the U to say, hey, I don't have access to this article. I don't feel like waiting on interlibrary loan. Can you send it to me really quickly because I have a thought and I don't want to lose it, right? So scholars of color are also working against differences in institutional resources that might also impact their ability to write, to cite, and to engage with one another. Well, all of that's happening in the background. All of that is leading to these disparate experiences that faculty have. And then we're at the academy where white scholars tend to cite white scholars, that are most published in the most gatekept journals that tend to have white reviewers and also have white editorial boards, which also means they have white approaches to understanding and knowing. So if white scholars make up 75% of the academy, they hold most of these editorial board positions. They are the people who are reviewing the bulk of our work and don't necessarily have the cultural competence or lens to do this. Not all, but some, right? We have a lot of accomplices and a lot of great allies who do know how to engage our work, but we're working against a system that is inherently unjust just by the numbers of folks who are within it. And citations are how we measure impact. And impact is determined by our H indices and our I-10 indices. So I'm a first-gen college graduate. I'm a first-gen academic. I am new to the academy. I feel the need to break down what in the world is an H index and an I-10 index, because I scream them from the mountaintop to make sure scholars of color know what they are, because these are metrics that some people are taught and others are not. So an H index corresponds to a scholar's H, right? Or of their in papers, so total number of papers you have that have been cited at least H times, while the rest of your papers or in number of papers have less than H citations. I promise I'm going to break that down. An I-10 index refers to the number of papers you have that have been cited 10 or more times. Now, the lower these numbers are, the less likely someone is to gain tenure, the less likely someone is to gain promotion, and the less likely someone is to become cited in those highly cited journals, because you don't have the immediacy of those quick citations from the very beginning once your paper is published. Now, I'm going to fall on the sword and use myself as a really good example. Acknowledging that I am in education, my field works a little bit differently than medicine and health. I do health disparities research. However, education has its own weird things, but we'll use me as an example because I can. So I also didn't want to call out any other particular person without asking for their permission. So if you look in the top right corner, right here on Google Scholar, it gives you your total number of citations, the date since you've been first published, your H index, and your I-10 index. Now, I want to acknowledge that I have a lot of relative social power, privilege, and positioning, right? I am at a regional comprehensive university, but I came out of an R1. I do a lot of networking, and I am not afraid of asking questions and simply walking up to people and saying, hey, I think we should work together, and here's why. So all of that has given me a relative amount of privilege in terms of what is going to be presented here. So according to Google, my H index is 6. This means that I've published at least 6 papers that have each received at least 6 citations, while the rest have been cited less than that. You can see some of my most cited papers right here on the very first page of my Google Scholar, because Google Scholar's default is to go to your papers that are most cited and who they've been cited by, so that folks can, if you're actually on Google, you can click cited by and see everyone who's talking about the paper. My I-10 index is 4, which means 4 of my papers, which you can see right here on the screen, have been cited or have at least 10 or more citations. If we look at the sort of order and ranking of my work in terms of citations, there's a piece from 2020, for example, that's co-authored, that's doing pretty well. That's exciting. Yay. It's one of the things that counts for tenure. Whole different conversation, right? But I'm also new to the academy. I'm only a 3rd-year faculty member. I started out on the student services side of the house. And as a newer faculty member, I spent, like most early career scholars right now, much of my time on the tenure track working as best as I can in a pandemic. So that means I'm now reaching a point where some of my things are coming out. Some of my work is making its way through journal review processes and revisions. And I have to make sure I find ways that people know that this work exists so that they can go cite it. But also, I have to wait for those papers to come out where people cite me to increase my H index and my I-10 index, right? But the tenure track clock doesn't fully allow space for that waiting process. So unless you're in a program that does hyper publishing at an institution where being a research researcher is a core piece of your identity. We started this talk where the dean gave a wonderful acknowledgement that publishing and writing and all of this is a core piece of what you all do. So if you're not in an institution where that is part of the foundation and the very fabric of your existence there, you're likely not going into tenure with a ton of citations, if many citations at all, unless you're doing some of that networking piece and leveraging some of that relative privilege that I talked about when I was on my previous slide. So I have a ton of things that came out, most of which at the end of 2021. And I took it upon myself, once looking at my Google Scholar in order of release date, to make sure I let everyone in my field know I have new work. These are some areas that it's about. If you don't have access to the paper, you can email me. I would love for you to cite me, right? And it takes a lot of vulnerability to do that, to say, hey, I want to broadcast and put my work out there. But these are things that scholars of color often have to do, especially if they're coming from a lower resourced institution, to ensure that their work is going to be cited at all, so that they have those citation metrics on their way to tenure. So taken together, I like to tell folks all of these things undergird this nasty concept of publish or perish, right? We've all heard this, which is yet another way that we systemically exclude scholars of color. So if we look at some of the existing literature and research, a lot of scholars of color tend to name that their desire to even go to graduate school and into specialized fields like public health are rooted in a desire to improve the conditions of their communities, right? I grew up in a particular space. We're in a food desert. We're in a hospital desert. There's a lack of access to all of these resources that I know my community needs, and I want to change that. We read that in admissions letters and admissions essays for graduate students all the time. But as we focus on those numerical metrics, rather than the quality and sort of full impact of the content from the last slide, we can expect to see that some scholars of color will either have to, going back to Delgado's point at the beginning, abandon their initial aims to focus on scholarship that's popular, that's easily cited, that's not controversial, so that they can move through the peer review process quickly and they can be accepted quickly, right? Or we may lose some scholars of color who feel like the fight towards tenure, academic success, so on and so forth, that requires abandoning of work that is important to them, that requires them to pathologize the communities they care about, is not worth it. So they make a decision as graduate students to go into industry, to skip the academy, to not be a part of that long-term knowledge production process. So this is severely limiting our ability to have new, innovative, and unique contributions within the academy. And as we engage a discussion of citational ethics, I want to make sure I point out that this is not an issue that is limited to string citations in a paper, to course syllabi, that this is about more than academic writing.
Rock and I were raised with so many of the same values, like you work hard for what you want in life, that your word is your bond, that you do what you say you're going to do.
My parents impressed on me the values that you work hard for what you want in life, that your word is your bond and you do what you say and keep your promise,
that you treat people with dignity and respect, even if you don't know them and even if you don't agree with them.
That you treat people with respect. They taught and showed me values and morals in their daily life. That is a lesson that I continue to pass along to our son. And we need to pass those lessons on to the many generations to follow.
And Barack and I set out to build lives guided by these values and to pass them on to the next generation, because we want our children and all children in this nation to know that the only limit to the height of your achievements is the reach of your dreams and your willingness to work hard for them.
Because we want our children in this nation to know that the only limit to your achievements is the strength of your dreams and your willingness to work for them.
Example in politics, right? This is not something that is an issue solely limited to the academy, and it's not one that is going to go away soon. But also, it's one that our students are aware of, right? Our students are noticing these indignities, lack of credit, lack of attribution, and lack of citational equity in their daily lives as well. And so this is a screenshot of an NPR article talking about how Black TikTok creators, which are primarily high school students, but there are some great folks outside of the high school context on there as well, who began to protest and strike because they were receiving a lack of credit for their work. So what's happening is you have all of these Black, many of them working class, but super creative young folks who are creating dances, they're creating content, they're creating funny videos, so on and so forth. And then white creators see them, stitch them, mimic them, whatever the case may be. And the white creator is the person who ends up on Ellen, or they're the person who ends up on television or the late night show, or insert media piece here for their ability to dance or for what they've done, without ever acknowledging that someone created this content, that someone came up with this idea, and that someone else put in a lot of hard work. And all you have to do is say, yes, I'm really great at this, and here's the person I learned it from. So our students are also, and across the generations, we're all grappling with what it means and what it feels like to not receive the full credit for the work and the weight of the work that we're doing and the contributions that we're making. And in order for us to combat all of this, we need accomplices in this work. We need folks who are going to show up for us. And it is especially important for folks who are sort of on the margins within the margins, right? So I think of Indigenous folks. There's an article by Gartner et al. 2021, and they say, when public health considers the health and disease status of Indigenous people, it often does so using a racial lens. In recent decades, public health researchers have begun to acknowledge that commonly employed racial categories represent history, power dynamics, embodiment, and legacies of discrimination rather than innate biology. Even so, public health has not yet fully embraced an understanding of other components of identity formation for Indigenous people, including political status within Native nations. And so they use the article to talk about this sort of racial conceptualization of indigeneity and why that makes public health inadequate for this population. So a couple of slides ago, I showed how many faculty there are in public health, how many there are broken down by these sort of racial categories that we've created and continue to perpetuate in our society, right? And on there, it acknowledges that there are 40 Indigenous or Alaska Native faculty across the 130 Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health institutions, where there are more than 10,000 faculty, right? So if we take that in conversation with what Gartner et al. Brings us to think about in terms of the inadequacy of racial conceptualizations of indigeneity for Indigenous folks, this means that our continued acceptance of relegating Indigenous scholars to the margins means we're not only missing their representation as a piece of the field, we're not only missing their brilliance as a sort of site from which we can draw, but we're quite literally misunderstanding the needs and the experiences of the Indigenous community. And that can have broad scale implications for how we collaborate with Indigenous communities, how we support Indigenous communities in engineering their own health success across this country. So we need to also think about the sort of indignities, right, of taking folks' work, of not appropriately citing folks' work, of not centering the experiences and work that folks are doing, and the implication that has for our ability to actually mitigate and address disparities and problems in public health issues. And so this political nature of citations have led many folks to sort of add to this lineage of critiquing the maintenance of whiteness and Western values in the academy and in academic writing. And there are things for us to think about. So I opened talking a little bit about the imperial scholar, right? Delgado's way of sort of breaking down how this is something that happened in civil rights literature and how in the law, folks continue to cite primarily, or in that case only, white men as experts on civil rights issues. But there are some contemporary movements to draw attention to these problems of equity and to move us away from repeating these same mistakes. So one created in 2015 is Cite Her Work. And it talks about its academics thinking about us, moving away and ending the practice of only privileging certain voices while marginalizing others. The creator of Cite Her Work is Dr. Keshana Gray, and she uses Cite Her Work as a hashtag and a call to action, right, to encourage people to cite women and to especially cite and center women in fields and areas of study where women are historically underrepresented and marginalized. Cite a Sister was a hashtag co-created by myself and one of my friends, Dr. Joan Collier, who's at Rutgers, specific to Black women, right? Because we know that anti-Blackness is something that is pervasive, that is global, and that can be found across and within communities of color. So we created Cite a Sister to say to people that we need to center the bodies of knowledge, the contributions, the literal writings of Black women and Black women's work. But also, when you hear something in one meeting and you go to the next meeting and you say that brilliance, make sure you name the brilliant person from which you got it, right? So how is it that we are drawing attention to and thinking of citational equity, not only in our academic writing, but in our speech, in our communications patterns, in the things that we do? There's also communication so white. And so a group of communication scholars got together and they coded and analyzed the racial composition of primary authors of articles and citations in one of their major journals, or across some of their major journals, between 1990 and 2016. That is a long time span. And within that, they found that scholars of color remained underrepresented in those publication rates, citation rates, and editorial positions. And so they used their paper to talk about communication so white as a way to start a conversation about the pervasive nature of this and the need to address this in order to make headway and to make progress. Another project is the Syllabus Project. So there's a website of the same name. Feel free to take a screenshot of this screen, y'all. Totally A-okay with that, right? And so the Syllabus Project is a Zotero library of resources and citations that began as a lively Twitter discussion. And so on their website, they say, has anyone else noticed how often environmental history syllabi largely omit women and scholars of color? Let's all work to diversify our syllabi. It will strengthen our teaching, our scholarship, and our field. And so they created this website and this place to hold and sort of co-create and co-construct knowledge where people can pull from, and they don't have to ask questions of, well, who is a scholar of color that I can find, or how do I find out what's being published, or where do I go, or I'm uncomfortable asking someone for their identity. How do I make my class diverse? They've put all of that in citation form and answered all of those questions for folks who are engaging with the Women's Environmental History Network and who are engaging in environmental history across the board. So these are roadmaps, right? These are sort of models and modules from which we can pull from and think about how we engage our own syllabi and what this can look like even if we created an example of it within public health. So what's next, right? How do we do some of that in the public health piece? So one of the considerations we have to make is that I've told you all this, now you have to actually do something about it, right? Or as James Baldwin says, the paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which they are being educated. So it is now part of you all's responsibility, or y'all, as we say in the South, it's part of y'all's responsibility to unpack, to think about, to leverage, and then do something with all of the information that I presented to you here in this talk. There are things that we can all do to be a part of this and to help advance and mitigate these issues that I'm talking about. So senior scholars can advocate for scholars of color, especially those who are early career, by nominating them in their work for awards, by directing their students to read, center, and cite the work of these folks. But one of the surest ways senior scholars can help is through the creation of special issues and making space for junior scholars to do some of this important, critical, identity conscious research within the public health sector. So when you put out a call for abstracts, whether it's a special issue for scholars of color or it's one that's broadly open, what would happen if senior scholars said, I need you to submit a positionality statement and contend with your social positioning in the academy to tell us why your piece should also be a part of this series, right? So why should you, scholar from Harvard, go through the special issue process when you could have just as much success in a traditional review? Let's unpack that and let's have a conversation about that, right? What would it look like if when we started putting together these special issues and special calls, we attended to some of these inequitable issues that are happening across institutions and across scholars by identity and by race? Senior faculty, especially white senior faculty, need not only then cite and center scholars of color, but that's a piece of it, right? They can also sponsor scholars of color. So we have folks who mentor us. We have folks who advocate for us. Scholars of color need people who are going to sponsor them. And sometimes being a sponsor might look like providing resources to a scholar of color who's really brilliant at a nearby institution, right? Where they have limited infrastructure and maybe need some more resources. We can add folks as co-PIs on some of our major grants and make sure that they are able to do some grant work and have some experiences with grants, because what we know about grants is the fastest way to get a grant is to have a grant, and the fastest way to have a grant is for someone to place you onto a grant. And so making sure we're attuned to the differential infrastructures, mentorship, research, and opportunities that folks have is a fast way that we can help to mitigate some of these barriers and issues of citational inequity in the academy. This is a special issue in your field, in health, education, and behavior. Use this special issue. Now, I did cut it off. This is not the full thing. There's a lower page and a second page, right? But look at these scholars of color. Look at what they're saying. Look at who they're citing, right? Create your own citation train. This person is citing, this person is citing, that person is citing, this person. Oh, I don't know that name. Let me pull that out and see what I can find out about their work. And so even I like to do this as a class project, right? Having students, particularly students who are on the advanced level, think about how do you backwards map, right, to some of the earlier pieces or foundational pieces that maybe you missed as a graduate student, as a faculty member, because your program wasn't diverse, because you didn't have a faculty member of color, because we know white scholars tend to cite and teach other white scholars. In this special issue that's also on the screen, I found one of the pieces from the editorial editor very interesting. And they said, we received 165 proposals. The guest editorial board reviewed them, and we collectively selected 14 articles in this issue, and that's on page 235. So they selected 14 of 165 proposals. Clearly, there is not only an urgent need for special issues, for folks to find ways to submit their work and to have their work included, but there is an urgent need for us to do some of this repeatedly and consistently so that folks who aren't able to make it in a particular kind of journal, particular kind of special issue, so on and so forth, might be able to get their work out there. We know that there is often a limit on the number of articles that can go into a particular issue, right? But as evidenced by the response to this call, there's plenty of people not only to consider, but plenty of ideas that folks want to put out there. Another suggestion could be the creation, formation, and management of a publicly editable directory of scholars of color in public health, right? So here's a list of folks in the field. Here are the institutions they're at. Here's a couple of their recent works. This is a list of some of the areas and topics from which they write about, draw about, things that you can think about in terms of engaging with them for collaboration, right? And so not leaving this work and these words on the page and leaving them behind these academically gate-kept journals, but bringing it to life by putting one another in conversation with each other in person, on paper, outside of conferences, through social media, so on and so forth. Another option is to do the Gray test. The Gray test was created and named in honor of Dr. Keshana Gray, who created Cite Her Work. And the Gray test works to establish more than a minimum standard for citing, but it's also about sort of engaging works by women scholars. And so it plays on this idea or the construct of the Bechdel test, right? And so the Gray test questions whether authors can meet a minimum threshold of including 2 white women and 2 women of color minimum in their biography or references. By reviewing a syllabus or a manuscript for such minimal inclusion, we can not only force folks to think about who are the people we're centering, whose knowledges are we legitimizing in the academy, whose knowledge do we think of as sort of important or integral to our work, but also whose work are we intentionally and materially engaging ourselves as faculty. So part of the onus is on all of us to make sure as we're creating our new publications, as we're writing our next set of papers, as we're collaborating with our students and folks across the country, we are also legitimizing these forms of knowledge that are created by folks who have been relegated to the margins of the academy. So that's the GRAY test. You can find all about it on Dr. Kishana Gray's website. And there are so many other folks who are trying and using this as a springboard for making changes and ensuring that we're thinking about citational equity within the classroom, within our writing, within our course syllabi, and in our knowledge-making processes. Some other things that we can do is to reflect and plan, right? We need to deliberate on what is resonating with you when you've left here today. What types of support exist on your campus? What types of support structures can scholars of color use on your campus? And if you don't know the answer to that, finding out and making sure people are aware of those resources. If they don't exist, making sure those resources begin to be created for folks to access as part of your institution and your institution as a broader piece of higher education. Thinking about how we advocate for scholars of color and center scholars of color within our locus of control, right? So I have full domain over my course syllabi. I had a student write a comment a couple of years ago, and at first I was offended, right? We all get those teaching evals. We're like, how dare they say this? But it has since become my favorite comment that a student has ever written. I taught a course on college students. I teach in higher education administration. And so it's about contemporary college students. What are their issues? What are they facing? What do we know about them? And one of my teaching evaluations said, this is a class about college students, not a class about students of color. That is the most amazing thing someone has ever said to me. I am glad that I have ruffled your feathers, because what are students of color, if not college students for one, but two, how many times have students of color been centered in our research, in our syllabi, in our classes, and in our work? Clearly not very often if my singular class as part of our broader curriculum upset you, right? So this was a moment where at first I was like, how dare they? And now I'm like, yes, I made this person have to think about someone other than themselves and someone that they probably didn't know a whole lot about because of the shifting demographics of our college population. But then balance is another piece we have to think about, right? So scholars of colors face undue expectations and pressure. We have students come up to us. We have to do extra work for Black History Month or Heritage Month or Asian American Heritage Month, like insert thing here. I often think of how many people assign to students, go and interview an Indigenous person and ask them about that. Nope, don't do that, right? And so folks are bombarded with service requests and expectations around their identities that make it more difficult for them to engage in this academic writing process and to simply engage in the academy as it is structured and designed. So what can you do to make sure people are experiencing better balance in this educational setting? What can you do to make sure folks have some additional time? If you're a dean, if you're a hiring authority, if you are someone in power, are you paying scholars of color for their first couple of years as part of your institution to do research in the summer, so they're not spending the summer trying to teach to make extra money? Easy fix. We don't know if the difference between $4,000 or $5,000 or insert amount here over a summer is the difference between 1 or 2 journal articles or someone not being able to get that done. And once you've gotten in that groove of summers are for writing, or I'm able to take this time, or it's perfectly okay for me to do this, you're able to keep that going. So think about what it is you can do, what resources you have, and how you might leverage them to support and encourage scholars of color to engage in balance as part of this academic process. But ultimately, right, these legacies of systemic racism, of colonization, so on and so forth, mean that citations are not neutral. Instead, they are deeply connected to and driven by racial and colonial hierarchies and power systems. So it's on all of us to not only do something about it, but to say something about it, to do something about it after we've said something about it, and then to do something about that, doing something about it, right? Are we assessing and seeing how effective we're being as we engage as part of this process? And doing that in a sort of circular loop will allow us to better support, better retain, and better recruit scholars of color in public health, use them in our classrooms to leverage their work and to teach the next generation of public health scholars how to be equitable, how to be more fair, and how to censor the works of folks who may not look like, sound like, or talk like them, but ultimately have the best interests of public health at heart. So with that, I say thanks to the folks who created my beautiful slides that I have been able to engage. And I invite all of you to offer questions, comments, so on and so forth. This is my contact information where you can connect with me.
Well, thank you so much, Britt, for such a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I think you really have opened our eyes to, number one, some of the impacts that many, I think, have the Academy has perhaps employed over time. And I'd say sort of an unconscious bias that is in existence. It certainly made me reflect on, who am I citing? And you spoke about, this imperial lineage and how I think that is very much an issue that is really troubling, and what we need to do to be much more conscious of that.
Absolutely.
So I do want to have a chance to open up the floor to any questions or discussion points that anybody here would like to bring up. You're welcome to go into the chat box and add some questions. And we'd love to unmute you if you're willing to have a conversation today with Britt. So we'll sort of allow that to happen. I did have a couple of questions here that was brought up. So what are your thoughts about the blinded review process? And certainly there is a movement even to do unblinded reviews. So could you speak to your some ideas around that?
Ooh, yeah, I have mixed feelings, right? And so partly I'm primarily a qualitative researcher, so I'm big qual, little quant. I do mixed methods work, but I'm a big qualitative researcher. And so that means that I'm always adding a positionality statement to my research. And in that positionality statement, I inherently give away the identities that are core to me, to my work, how I engage my work, and that inform the approaches that I'm taking, right? And so I tell folks all the time that what we think of as a blinded review process is rarely ever blinded because of things like that do enhance our work. And so I wouldn't ever advocate that we take those out, but instead that we think about the impact that happens when there are so few people who are studying a particular thing, who are engaging a particular kind of work, and how we're able to figure out who they are. So another example I give is I do some work around health disparities, particularly relating to HIV/AIDS in college contexts. There is no one else in higher education and student affairs publishing on that right now. And so I have had people walk up to me at conferences like, hey, I reviewed your conference proposal and I knew it was you because you're the only one, right? And so how do you ever even give someone a fair shake at being reviewed if they're doing and taking on some of the work that we know scholars of color take on, those things that are at the margins and the margins? So I have mixed feelings, right? Because I don't feel like the process has been blinded for me since I began my academic career. I don't really know what that feels like. I write about social class. I'm one of the only Black women in higher ed writing about social class, right? So boom, I write that positionality statement and people know it's me. So I feel like part of me wants to say, I like the idea of open review because it helps to mitigate some of those comments where you read them and it's like, reviewer 2, you would not have said that to my face if you had to say it to my face and your name was attached, right? But the other piece is, would I, as a junior scholar, feel comfortable telling a senior scholar if I'm reviewing their paper, this is trash? Probably not, right? And so there are so many intricacies in terms of power dynamics that we have to unpack, that we have to think about. when we start talking about the impact of the review process. And I think some first steps are folks need to be comfortable admitting when they don't know how to review something. So I got an invitation from a journal for this really cool paper about Black students. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I looked at the methods and it was advanced quant. That's a little bit above my little Q quant, right? And I was like, nope, don't know what I'm doing. And I wrote to the editor and said, this is amazing. I hope this is published. However, I don't understand enough about the methods in the sections that are written here for me to adequately review this paper. Here are some scholars of color that do amazing quant work, that understand what's presented here and can do this paper a little more justice than me. That doesn't take a lot. It means putting your ego aside and admitting that you don't know everything, which we academics are not necessarily good at, but we have to come to terms with the fact that you can't know everything. There's just too much to know. And so I think part of it is making sure we have adequate, competent reviewers as part of the review process. I think part of it is expanding some of these editorial boards and thinking about how we even do selection processes for editorial boards. Same thing with grants, same thing with all of the things that we have to apply for in the academy that are rooted in or based off who do you know, who is your mentor, who's the person that can advocate or sponsor for you, especially until we have folks who are going out of their way to better support scholars of color. So all of that to say, I have mixed feelings. I don't know how I feel exactly, but I do think it's complicated and it's something that we have to start thinking about broadly as part of the academy, especially as journals start to capitalize more and more and more on the work we're doing. So we have journals out here that are even proposing doing, for example, fast-track reviews. Well, if you can pay for a fast-track review and you can pay for open access, for example, that further exacerbates these citation equity issues that I'm talking about, because people who are at Research Ones, people who are at institutions with a lot of money can pay not only to have their paper go through the review process faster, they can pay for more people to be able to access their paper freely, and then everyone's reading your paper, everyone's citing your paper, all of your stuff is coming out faster, all because you have access to money, power, and prestige, not because of the quality of your work. And so I think we as academics have to think about the fact that journals are coming up with more and more ways to capitalize on our knowledge, to capitalize on our labor as reviewers, to capitalize on everything we're doing as part of this publication process on the way to tenure, and figure out how to embed more equity in it on our side, especially if we are going to continue to have our work gatekept and behind these journals that people in the public who need to read what we're writing and who need to engage our work don't have access to, and definitely don't have access to if they're not at a particular kind of institution and know how to find that.
Thank you so much, Britt. You really talk a lot about sponsorship. And I think there are many faculty here who really want to be intentional about that sponsorship and increase our awareness. And I think that's something that, how can we find really the scholars of color? I think about PubMed. We use PubMed, and I'll be honest, there are papers there that I don't find everything that I want in PubMed, and sometimes they're just not included because there is often a process in which a certain journal ends up being in PubMed, or you have to take some extra steps in order to ensure that your article is found in PubMed. So what are some of those tips that you can share for faculty who want to be these mentors and support our scholars of color, not only within our institution, but really, we've got a call to do this throughout the world?
Yeah, I think part of it is admitting and openly saying, be it at conferences and digital media spaces, and spaces where people are able to sort of get the word out, naming that you as a senior scholar are open to mentorship, supporting and engaging with scholars of color because they haven't necessarily had the same equitable experience on the way into the academy and as they're moving through the academy. So part of it is being confident in naming that aloud. I think there's often a fear as faculty that's definitely rooted in a reality that if we say we're open to supporting or helping folks, everyone is going to come to us. But also we have to acknowledge that everyone's not a good fit, right? I have students I make relationships with all the time and they're like, I want you to be my mentor. And I'm like, let's see. Right? Let's see if we're actually a good match. And I work with them and, we don't necessarily align as much as we could, but here's my friend, Dr. Layla McLeod, who's a couple institutions over, who would be a better fit for you. And you can still always come to me and ask me questions. Right? And so it goes back to that piece of being able to admit what we can do for folks, naming openly that we're willing to do that for folks, and then paying attention when people are doing things. Who are the folks that are being publicized in the Chronicle of Higher Education, who are asked for quotes and commentary about things. Are they at a particular kind of institution? Are they putting their work out there on Twitter, so on and so forth? And then just clicking it and reading it and seeing a little bit more about someone and sending a message that says, hi, junior scholar, I appreciate your work. Let me know if you need any support or assistance, or there's any way I can help you along the way in your academic career, right? Because a lot of early career scholars are anxious, particularly scholars of color, about trying to make those connections, because we know folks are asking the senior scholars of color already. So we need white senior scholars, words, to come along and say, I'm willing to be this person for you. I'm someone that you can come to, and I'm able and willing to engage in that conversation with you. So I think that's a piece of it. The other part is we have to stop being scared of having conversations around identity in the academy. When we are at our conferences, when we're meeting and talking about conference papers and sort of working through and thinking about all of those things, we have to make space to acknowledge, or for people to talk about identity and to be more comfortable speaking about identity, so that we can actually address some of these things.
Thank you so much, Britt. This is really, really important for our mentors, white mentors, senior mentors out there, to think about what we could do. I want to bring up another question that's just come in through the chat. What would you like to see from universities to better support, celebrate, and advance the careers of Black faculty and other faculty of color? In my experience, Black faculty have 10 times the mentees as white counterparts, and yet receive only about half the recognition.
Yep. Yes. So part one is yes, right? I think a piece of it is acknowledging that the service that faculty of color and Black faculty in particular are doing is something that is worthy of the tenure process, is something that is valuable in the tenure process. And so I think I would like to see institutions and universities in particular acknowledge when folks have a ton of advisees or a ton of mentees or a ton of folks they're working with on research teams or in lab, so on and so forth, because it is the socialization process is something that is a labor of love. It takes work. It is something that we have to put thought and care into in order to avoid causing harm that we're trying to redress as part of this conversation to begin with, right? And so institutions need to acknowledge that in the tenure process, and not just, oh, do you engage and mentor students? Checkbox, but no, what is the depth of that engagement? How many students have reached some outcomes that they never thought they could reach, right? I love to give the example of, I had a graduate assistant when I first came to St. Cloud State who was super interested in food insecurity. And I was like, all right, well, how about we write a paper about food insecurity? I'm interested in social class. These things are deeply interconnected. Let's go for it, right? That's extra work that I didn't necessarily plan on doing as a Black woman faculty member, who's the only Black woman faculty member in my program, but I knew this would be a good developmental moment for my student. And that particular student has gone on to not only testify before our state legislature here in Minnesota, but to get their dream job working on food insecurity issues for college students, right? And so part of it is, how do we measure the impact of that mentorship and of some of that sort of service labor? We need to start figuring out what tangible ways we can account for that in the tenure process. And we also need to pay people. And at some point, we need to just acknowledge that we need to pay people, right? So there are different ways that institutions do this. Some institutions pay based off committee membership, pay based off how many dissertations you chair. There's extra course release or additional time taken away, depending on if you cross a certain threshold for a certain number of mentors, right? And so it's not just benchmarking at peer and aspirant institutions, but looking at the practices and policies across institutions around the country, around the world, and figuring out what can we afford to do in our area? How do we exercise and implement that, and pilot and testing that, and then implementing it full term if it is something that is successful in your particular environment? And so it's for me, the onus is on universities and university leaders to say we are going to put financial resources and time and energy into this process, and not continue to always do things the way we're going to do it, right? I tell folks all the time, my biggest frustration with the tenure process, irrespective of institution, right? I showed my Google Scholar. I've been, I think, highly productive as someone who's been a tenure track faculty member for an entire pandemic, right? My biggest frustration is we have folks who went through the tenure process so long ago, judging the tenure process now when they would not have been successful in that same dynamic. So there are many senior scholars who wrote one book or one article or one so on and so forth, who at the very end of their careers, who came up in a different academic time span, but are also creating added burdens and added hoops for scholars to jump through, especially scholars of color, and wanting them to meet these almost impossible thresholds to get to tenure that they wouldn't be able to reach themselves if they were going through tenure right now. And so part of it is also some collective recollection, right, of what we actually did to get to where we are as part of our positions as we move up in the academy, but also recognizing that times have changed, policies have changed, that practices have changed, and norms have changed. And so how do we help to put money behind to mitigate some of those changes? Because they're all shifting, but the clock hasn't changed. Right? People are saying we're going to account for the pandemic, rarely, right? So maybe you get an extra year, but what is a year if you've lost productive brain space and time and energy and all of these things that impact your ability to execute and to do your work? And so universities need to celebrate these things through awards. We need to celebrate it through monetary compensation. We need to celebrate it through putting our money where our mouths are, to when we say we want faculty of color and we want those folks to reflect our student populations, we need to do everything we can to retain them. And that begins by acknowledging the goodness that they're giving us, especially when they're doing the work of retaining themselves, their students, and other folks outside the institution.
Really beautifully said. I think I had read a Chronicles for Higher Education article that indicated, if we're going to commit to diversity, equity, inclusion, it needs to be beyond the lip service, and we've got to put the resources into it. So absolutely appreciate that. And this also makes us think about like what is our tenure review really look like, and how do we measure impact? We can't use the bean counting approach in and of itself. It really needs to be a holistic process.
Absolutely.
There was a question here about, the positionality statement, which is really interesting. So how does, you've mentioned this a couple of times, I think for, scholars of color, faculty of color, could you just share with us, like, how does that look like? Where do you put that? And, how do you deal with some faculty who just may be too shy to put that out? Or, there's this sort of imposter syndrome that sometimes is felt, right? And some people have been hired under a faculty minority opportunity programs, and it becomes difficult when one has to think about how are they viewed in the academy. And it's been challenging and controversial at the same time. And yet we understand the importance of having our positions and being open about who we are. I mean, after all, that is the way that we can promote and advocate for ourselves. So kind of a long, kind of complicated question, but any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, my brain is pulling me in a couple of different directions, right? So I think the first piece for me is I believe in affirmative action. I'm a full-on, I want to go on and say this for the good of the order, for the good of the YouTube or wherever this will live, right, as part of your institution. Affirmative action is not about identity. It is inherently, right? It is about redressing wrongs that are done to people on account of identity. And so for me, when I hear an institution say, we've created a program to bolster the infrastructure or number of faculty of color we have on campus, that is redressing a wrong that has happened. It's recognizing that we have systemically excluded and made it difficult for faculty and scholars of color to join our sort of academic academy and our lineage and sort of realm, right? So that's part one. The second piece of that is scholars of color have to stop being ashamed that this is the way that they have made a sort of impact or foot in the door at some of these institutions, because white people are not ashamed of being legacy admits, and on the undergraduate level, they're not ashamed of having mentors who make phone calls to make sure they're a finalist for a particular position because they were just so nervous in that interview and it didn't fully show, right, or convey the fullness and the greatness of who they are as a candidate for a particular interview, right? And so there are ways that people have been using systems, policies, and structures that are written and unwritten, right, de jure and de facto, that exist in our society for so long, and they haven't apologized for or felt bad for using it. And it's usually only scholars of color who do feel bad for taking advantage of something that is designed to address their systemic exclusion. So I think the first piece is we have to move away from, I don't want to be the affirmative action hire. I do. Why not? Right? I tell the story all the time that I'm a first generation college student, but my grandfather was a veteran. He didn't get to use his GI Bill. I'm a first gen college student because Black veterans were excluded from using the education benefits that they earned and deserved from going to war and fighting for this country. Why would I be ashamed of any of that, right? And so we have to stop thinking about these as sort of individual and sort of one-on-one representations of who we are or the quality of our scholarship, and instead as part of a larger process to move us toward progress, and acknowledging how exclusion has shown up. There was another piece of your question though. Oh,
positionality statement,
right?
Yep. And how can we do that in our work?
Good question. So I think we've across a lot of academic fields, institutions, structures and areas, folks are starting to add on diversity statements and so on and so forth as part of the hiring process. I think that's an opportunity for us to talk about our positionality and talk about our social positioning and how we leverage and use that for good and what it means for us. And I think it's important for us to read those and not just use them as a check mark on a job or another piece of the application, right? But also institutions need to be doing statements of their own with facts, with figures, with resources that talk about, here's the last faculty member of color we've hired. Here's the last number of faculty members of color that we've tenured. Here are ways that we are supporting faculty of color, right? So we need to be doing, as institutions, we need to be doing the work of also putting in our positionality statements and not just saying we care about this or we're going to address this or we're at the core of this and we know we should care about the community, but no, here are the actual outcomes of that press release I wrote 6 months ago. Here's what's changed. And looking back and assessing our culture, here are the things that look different. And then as scholars, we need to add some of that into our application processes. Qualitative research, we talk all the time about, you can't, because we don't believe that research can be neutral and that it is inherently political, you can't write a paper that is, to me, successful without acknowledging the lens and the values and the sort of constructions of knowledge that you bring to that work, right? I know when I'm coding my data, I'm thinking about all the things I've experienced as a Black girl from Atlanta, as I'm reading through my data, and that is a part of my lens. And I owe it to the audience to say, as I was reading through this, these are pieces of my identity that are core. These are things that showed up. These are things I was thinking about. And these are people that inform that, right? I tell people all the time that in dark and feminist epistemology is something that informs everything that I do. I have on my website my researcher responsibility statement for every study that I do. These are things that I'm committing to across every project that I take on, across every piece and body of work that I commit to, because I think that there needs to be a common thread of humanizing and honoring and acknowledging the contributions that my participants are making in conversation with my work. When I'm doing quantitative data, I know that it's only as good as the initial surveys and constructs that it was created upon. And so acknowledging that the person who created this probably wasn't thinking about critical quantitative methods or wasn't thinking about engaging identity in sort of its broadest form or beyond these 4 or 5 or 6 main categories that we talk about with racial identity in this country, right? And so it's a process. It's something that takes time. And so I think it's something that we have to practice doing both institutionally and individually in order for us to move towards some of those change. And then I saw that there was another question about would I recommend that Black women enter the academy as faculty and sort of remaining healthy in this career. I'll go ahead and answer that and say yes, and asterisks, right? Of course, I believe in the goodness of the academy. I have to in order to be able to stay here and try to sustain myself. But also, I think a piece of it is, academics, more than some other careers, I think we tend to think that our work is all of who we are. We tend to make all of sort of the way we show up to our work as part of our identity, and we lead with being an academic as part of our identity, instead of acknowledging that being an academic is what we do, it is not who we are. And so my advice for remaining healthy as we move through the academy and we work towards tenure is to do that, to separate what you're doing as part of your work on the tenure track from who you are as a person, not taking every single thing as sort of a personal slight, not being the person who's constantly hurt and displaying hurt and feels constantly aggrieved by the academy, and carrying that and carrying the weight of that with you all the time, because we know, right? Sometimes things happen not because of us, not because of who we are, because of who we are, right? There's a way that both of these things can happen at the same time. And so I think you remain healthy by detaching yourself from this being your all, your everything, and everything that you have, versus recentering yourself in sort of your family, right? Dr. Dominique Baker calls this your North Star. Like, what is your academic North Star? What is the thing that keeps you going? And what is the thing that sort of propels you? And as long as you're focused on that, you'll be able to more healthily remain and sort of exist in the academy. And then you find your people. So yes, I recommend folks enter the academy because we need to diversify. We need to get away from that 75% number in terms of full-time tenure and tenure track faculty being white, and that won't change if we're not applying for those jobs, and if we're not sort of demanding and requiring that our institutions pay attention to those numbers as part of this process.
Well, really beautifully said, and it's the perfect way for us to close the session. But I want to hand the mic back to Lauren for our last remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Marizan, and thank you, Britt. That was awesome. You ended up reminding me of some words from Toni Morrison about who you are not being what you do. And so I really appreciate this conversation today. I do want to remind our audience that we are asking you to fill out an evaluation. We're going to send that to Britt, as well as make sure that we're using that data to improve our own programming. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciated everyone coming out today. And again, this video will be available on our website. Have a great day. Bye.